Hundreds of millions of years ago, all continents were one vast supercontinent called Pangaea. Forests, deserts, and oceans stretched endlessly across a single world. But what did it truly look like? Tonight, we'll travel back to see Earth as it once was. If you enjoy this journey, please like, subscribe, and share, and tell us in the comments which part of ancient Pangaea would you explore first. Thank you for watching. Now let's begin. From far beyond the planet, the world around the time when Pangaea forms during the late Carboniferous into the Permian appears as a single joined landmass on a sphere that is otherwise wrapped almost entirely by water. And from this scale, the planet looks calm because details of terrain cannot be seen beyond subtle colour and tone. The planet turns slowly against darkness. Because distant vantage compresses time, this single landmass can be understood here as a near-continuous feature that persists for tens of millions of years. At this planetary range, the world still carries an atmosphere that bends sunlight at the limb of the sphere, and the band of refracted light provides gentle definition to the outline of the supercontinent. Away from the illuminated face, the night hemisphere remains quiet. No storms of any kind are described here because at this scale, only large zones of colour and shadow define the picture. The superocean Panthalassa wraps almost the entire planet, except where the faint boundary of the supercontinent intrudes like a singular enormous shape. This world is in a state that is not yet the later well-known fragmentation that will unfold deeper into the Mesozoic, because that breakup belongs to another time and is not described here. The sphere that holds Pangaea rotates steadily, and because the equatorial bulge of any rapidly rotating terrestrial body is slight relative to the overall radius, there is no exaggerated distortion visible, only the smooth, solid flattening that is normal for a rotating planet. Light touches water surfaces across much of the sphere. The superocean is so large that its surface is the dominant reflective field at this global vantage, and the land shape is only a single continuous asymmetrical plate surrounded by water. This supercontinent is assembled through earlier convergences of the continental blocks that form it. Those earlier tectonic collisions produced mountain belts and suture zones that now exist deep within the continuous land area. But at this planetary range, these features appear only as slight conditional texture, not as any viewable mountain shapes, because the scale is too large to show such topographic variation. Variations in reflectance over the surface of the land correspond to large climatic gradients that line up largely with latitude distance from coastlines and the patterning of the late Paleozoic Ice Age across the southern region of Gondwana. None of that is yet explored in depth here because this section must remain in this very outermost region of scope. The world here is a terrestrial planet at a stage when the continents have combined into nearly one piece. The thickness of the crust and the dynamics of mantle convection that shape the geometry of the supercontinent do not cause any visible disruption at this vast range. The supercontinent is broadly centered in the southern hemisphere in some reconstructions, and because the late Paleozoic Ice Age is present at this time, ice masses at southern high latitudes introduce brightness in those far southern areas. But again, from this perspective, that brightness appears more like subtle albedo change, not a detailed ice field, because that level of fine landscape must not be examined yet. From here, the atmosphere can only be seen as a thin envelope. Its thickness relative to the planet is smaller than the thickness of paper relative to a globe held in the hand, though such analogies are not spoken inside this narrative. The air layer refracts sunlight during limb crossing, and that refraction produces a narrow band of glowing colour. That band traces the boundary between illuminated hemisphere and darkness. High clouds may exist, but they are too small and subtle to appear, and because the narrative path forbids spectacle, they are not emphasized. This vantage is about the planetary stage. It is calm because it is too abstract to show agitation. Across many tens of millions of years, this single landmass remains the dominant outline on the face of the Earth. Even though climate, sea level and vegetation change, the overall unified geometry is steady at this macro viewpoint. Time passes only in concept here. Surface that is defined by continental crust appears as a muted blend of darker tones. Surface that is defined by oceanic crust beneath deep water appears as lighter tone when sun glint spreads across the superocean. Over the course of this span, which extends from around 335 million years ago into the Permian and up toward about 252 million years ago, the world retains this iconic state of singular continental union. There is no surface feature to reference longitude from this height, and the prime meridian used in human mapping does not exist here. Every point from this vantage is projectionless. The world is simply a sphere. There is no human concept present. No cultural concept exists. Only the slow turning of a massive lithosphere over mantle convection. The deep interior of the planet is hot. The deeper mantle convects slowly. The lithosphere rides that circulation. But from this vantage, no such interior motion is detectable. What is visible is singular landform scale. Pangaea covers nearly the entire face of the world. The Tethys realm to the east is not a visible line, only an inference of future closer zoom levels. Pangaea stands as one combined continental surface. The margin between dark land and reflective water forms a long, continuous fractal outline that encircles the entire supercontinent. There are no small scattered islands of major consequence from this far. Most oceanic island chains that will exist in later times are too small to register. From a planet-sized vantage, the superocean Pangaea spreads in every direction around the united land, a single continuous expanse that occupies most of the world and gives the planet a pale, reflective character under sunlight, while the joined outline of Pangaea lies like a dark, irregular mass within it. The water stretches across great arcs without interruption by large continents, because most continental crust is welded into one, so the sea covers nearly the entire face of the planet and receives the broad sweep of wind and light over distances that span thousands of kilometers. The surface is not a mirror because wind always touches water, and water always moves, yet the prevailing impression at this wide scale is steadiness, with long, low undulations that carry energy across open reaches and merge into one another until no single wave can be named. Thermal inertia defines the mood of the ocean. Heat enters slowly, mixes slowly, and leaves slowly, and this delay smooths daily swings and softens the sharpness of seasons, so the water becomes a quiet reservoir that ties together the energy of the planet. Axial tilt gives unequal sunlight to different latitudes, and the slow march of the subsolar point draws broad belts of warmth and cooler zones across the sea through the year. But these zones pass like gentle bands rather than sharp edges, their gradients spread by wind, evaporation, and the drift of near-surface water. Beneath the surface, density changes with temperature and salt content, organize the upper layers into slabs and lenses that slide past one another, rise or sink with great patience, setting up paths that carry surface characteristics into the interior and return interior water upward again far away. Yet from this wide viewpoint, these interior motions read as a quiet persistence rather than a visible pattern. Across the southern high latitudes, the late Paleozoic Ice Age leaves a clear stamp on climate, and ice grounded on Gondwana brightens the planet's lower hemisphere, throwing more sunlight back into space, and cooling the air that passes over the far southern sea while cold surface water edges outward and blends with the open Pangaea reaches. The effect at this scale is a broad pale halo rather than a field of detail. Where the sun climbs high over tropical belts, warm water spreads like a slow skin, thin compared to the depth below, but wide beyond measure, and over weeks and months that skin thickens or thins with the season, and with the balance of evaporation and rainfall transported from far coasts, while the night relieves the surface step by step without ever drawing sudden boundaries. Winds trace immense paths, because there are few continental barriers to divert them, so belts of easterlies and westerlies can sweep for long distances, setting surface water in motion, and building gyre-sized circuits that would be complex up close, but read as broad, drifts from far away, with piles of water slowly raised against pressure gradients on one side of an oceanic reach, and lower places formed on the other. Where dry air grows heavy with salt and heat over subtropical belts, water gives itself to the air as vapour and leaves behind denser brine, and that slight increase in density is enough to send a fraction of the surface downward, later turning vertical exchange into a habit of the sea. In higher latitudes, winter cooling makes surface water still heavier, so it dips under its neighbours and glides away at depth, with a resolve that lasts for centuries. The floor of Pangaea is not flat but offers mountain chains, trenches and broad plateaus born from slow spreading and faster consumption of oceanic crust, and lines of volcanoes rise where plates dive or pull apart. Yet from this level, the relief is hidden by water and declared only by the way the sea above it sometimes lifts a little, or tilts its surface where flows converge or diverge, so the memory of the crust below is present but muted. Light penetrates shallowly and defines a skin of brightness that supports floating life and tiny drifting animals and plants that graze on sunlight and on each other, but their abundance does not alter the immensity of the basin. Even in bloom, the water absorbs the sky rather than shifting its own colour strongly at this range, and the living film appears as a statistical presence rather than a visible field. The day side and night side of the globe exchange places without drama, and a long line of dawn advances westward as the planet turns, laying softness on the sea, drawing out the contrast between sunlit glint and the matte grey of early morning water, while evening reverses the effect as thermal contrasts unwind into the shared coolness of night. From time to time, distant chains of islands and arcs, lifted by subduction, rise like low steps from the open basin, breaking fetch and casting lee wakes across the water, but they remain minor punctuation in a grammar, written mostly by uninterrupted distances. Their ashen-weathered minerals drift outward and take part in the slow, settling rain of particles that blankets the deep floor where they will be stored for times longer than any season. Along the rim that touches Pangaea, the superocean narrows into shelves and embayments, not yet examined here, and along the far eastern side another marine realm extends where the Tethyan seas develop against the continental margin. But the focus remains on the open body that dominates the planet and defines the global setting, in which coasts, shelves and swamps will later be understood. The sun's warmth, the tilt of the axis, the spin of the planet and the size of the basin together produce wide gyres in mid-latitudes and equatorial streams that carry water east to west and west to east in steady exchange, seeding temperature patterns that endure for years and steering rafts of floating plant fragments and shelled swimmers along paths that circle slowly all of it, more suggestion than shape at this altitude. Air presses on the sea with a weight that varies from place to place, and the sea answers with slopes so slight that they are felt only by the way water begins to slide. Yet across thousands of kilometres, those slopes are enough to define the direction of motion, and the place where drifting things collect. Over very long spans, the crust beneath the ocean is digested at trenches and reborn at ridges, and the sea rides that Pangaea without recognizing it, renewing its floor while guarding its character as a single connected basin that outlasts countless surface changes along the shoreline of the supercontinent. The sound within the ocean is a continuous murmur of distant wind, long swell, and the quiet fracture of gas bubbles rising and breaking, all softened by depth, and even that sound fades into a sense of mass and patience when seen at this distance. Everything here proceeds with scale as the main condition. Distances are great times, our long gradients are broad, and the sea is large enough that it makes calm not by stillness, but by averaging motion over spaces too wide for sharpness. The impression that remains is of a world where water holds the majority of surface gathers and distributes energy with restraint, and gives the planet a stable face through the long interval when Pangaea is whole. Along the eastern margin of the supercontinent, the geography of water shifts from the global sweep of Pangaea into a different marine realm, where the margin between continental blocks and smaller terrains holds a long series of connected basins that together form what later workers call the Tethys realm, a warm and structurally complex set of seas that rinse the flanks of Pangaea and mingle with equatorial belts. In these waters, the scale is still oceanic rather than coastal, because the perspective remains broad, yet the water here differs from the open superocean, because continental crust stands closer on more than one side, and the boundary between deep ocean floor and shallower shelf steps upward faster into land. Light touches these seas in a manner that yields broad tropical belts of heat in many reconstructions where evaporation is strong and where long-lived flows of surface water meander along the margin of continental blocks against the lower broad regions that become embayments and epicontinental troughs. Because this marine system lies near where mantle convection draws irregular distribution of new crust and consumes old crust, the seafloor here is a mosaic of arc complexes, small oceanic basins and sutures left from earlier collisions, and those structures allow the sea to take many forms: deep troughs, shallow shelves, mud-filled depressions and narrow channels between platforms that have risen into islands or elongated peninsulas. In some places the water covers what will eventually be uplifted into mountains long after this time, but during the late Carboniferous and Permian, those future mountain belts lie at the level of sea, and the Tethys realm covers them with silence, leaving only the slow drift of suspended clay planktonic fragments and dissolved chemical constituents to record their position. Warm surface water in this realm tends to stratify, because near equatorial belts, the energy balance favours heating the upper layer and discourages mixing downward, and because the floor can rise abruptly, the upper layer becomes thick in some areas where sun remains steady over much of the year. Plankton in this water absorb light and convert it to organic matter, and tiny drifting animals graze upon that matter, generating chains of consumption and recycling that remain quiet in this description. But mark the marine character of these seas. Deeper down, these organisms breathe out carbon dioxide and release wastes that change the chemistry of the local water, and in certain stagnation zones, oxygen sinks to low values, because surface production of organic matter and its eventual decay consume the available oxygen. That zonation is not seen directly in this narrative, because the view remains wide, but its existence gives the water an internal structure that distinguishes this region from the more thoroughly mixed open Pangaean expanse. Terrains that ride plate boundaries here carry arcs of volcanoes, and these arcs shed ash into the sea, and ash grains settle gently through the water column and land on the basin floor to form part of the long sediment record. Where fresh volcanic glass lies in thin drapes across the bottom, diagenesis can later change it into clay minerals that will serve as further record of water chemistry. River systems that drain nearby continental zones deliver silts and dissolved ions into these seas when storm events inland move runoff seaward, and this material adds to clay-rich muds that spread across shelves during humid intervals, though the actual coastlines remain for later sections because the perspective here is still offshore at the oceanic domain scale. Light from the sun arrives at shallow angles during dawn and dusk, and for a short span each day these seas present a pale apron of glare that stretches from the limb of the planet into latitudes where Tethyan surface water is warm. Through the passage of tens of millions of years, the position of these seas relative to other land units shifts slowly because plates move and arcs collide, and terrains weld onto the continent, but such changes remain subtle over the intervals described here, and do not break the existence of this broad realm. The warmth of near-tropical belts influences surface salinity in dry conditions, where evaporation outpaces rainfall, and in these places water releases vapor to the air and leaves behind saltier mass that thickens the density of the top layer and can later sink in places where wind pushes surface water away from coastal bends. Where cooler air flows down from high plateau blocks along the continental flank, during seasonal changes the surface responds by chilling and by creating mild convection that mixes warm water downward, yet these vertical motions remain gentle and muted at the broad scale. Marine animals that swim in these seas include shelled swimmers with chambered architecture that allows buoyancy adjustment, and these animals drift in the upper water masses and serve as mobile elements of the pelagic community, but from this vantage their presence is statistical rather than visible. Schools of fish that evolved earlier swim across these basins, their patterns defined by food availability and by their physiology, but again their presence is not detailed, because the narrative remains at the ocean domain level. The seafloor beneath these waters lies closer to land and higher in profile than much of Pangaea, because some basins are near volcanic arcs and continental margins, and the base of the slope transitions into broad shelves that arch upward into the continental frame. From this scale, the topography remains only as the idea of a step in depth, not as visible canyons or ridges. At times, carbonate platforms may form where water is warm and clear, and where carbonate-secreting organisms grow, and these platforms produce broad fields of skeletal debris that accumulate quietly at depth. Such production does not demand reef spectacle. The description remains calm, and notes only that chemical conditions and biological activity allow carbonate muds to settle. Over time, the seafloor grows thicker with these muds, and chemical reactions between pore water and buried sediment change the minerals, slowly preserving the story of the Tethys region as layers of lithified solids that will be reorganized in later deep time. The entire realm is a marine system with boundaries that differ from the boundless horizon of Pangaea. It has edges, corridors, and corners that reflect the arrangement of continental blocks and arc lines. In some reconstructions, it expands far to the east and opens into a wide basin. In others, it is made of several linked basins. In either case, these waters share a character distinct from the open global ocean, because tropical and subtropical belts, continental proximity, and dynamic crustal margins supply warmth, sediment, and variability into these connected seas. Though the broad feel remains quiet at this scale, these waters are where mixing of continental-derived ions, volcanic ash, and biological carbon produce complex geochemical histories, recorded as gentle layers of settling particles that mask rough topography in silence. The realm is neither entirely closed nor fully merged with the global ocean, because it exchanges water through straits and through deeper channels, yet retains its structural individuality, so that the eastern side of Pangaea is washed by a marine province that carries tropical flavour and delicate stratification. Across this entire interval, these seas lie against the eastern flank of the supercontinent, an enduring marine domain that forms a warm and complex counterpoint to the wide and deeply stable superocean on the other side of the world. Coastlines of Pangaea appear as long irregular edges where land lifts out of shallow water, and where the superocean and the eastern marine provinces both taper upward into continental shelves that slope toward land with gradients too gentle to see at distance, yet sufficient to reduce water depth from open ocean values into zones where light penetrates more strongly, and where fine sediment from land accumulates. These shelves are the first inward step away from the broad marine realms, and they form plains beneath water that stretch far from the coast in some places and lie close to shore in others, depending on local topography inherited from crustal unions of earlier convergences. A shelf becomes a setting for long-term interaction between land, sea and air because waves that spread across wide oceanic fetches arrive here as broad fields of swell lose power slowly as friction grows and break at different angles depending on the shape of local coastlines. Beneath the surface currents that worked across Panthalassa or Tethyan waters ease their momentum as they climb this slope and push or pull suspended particles into graded beds that drape the shelf floor. Sand grains settle in some places as sheets, while clays settle in others as layers that are nearly invisible at any given moment, but become records of kilometers of sediment transported from continental interiors by river systems that drain far inland. Fresh water from land enters these coastal seas loaded with silts during times when major river discharge peaks and fresh water mixes with salt water to form lenses of lower density that ride atop denser saline layers, and once wind stirs those lenses, the surface films mix and then settle into a uniform density that helps spread nutrient-rich water across the shelf. Along many coastlines, the continental margin is low and extends as vast plains into shallow seas, so day-length light strength and temperature shape how much algae and bacteria can process dissolved nutrients. These organisms form microfilms on suspended sediment, and when they die, they help carry carbon downward toward the seabed building. Fine organic rich layers that contribute to the long-term carbon cycle. Sunlight here provides stronger energy than in deeper water beyond the shelf break, and where the water is clear, light penetrates into tens of meters of depth, supporting communities of small planktonic organisms and sometimes clusters of shelled animals that thrive, where currents bring dissolved minerals from rock weathering on land. The water remains calm at this description level because the focus remains on broad shelf geometry, rather than on individual storms or unnatural drama. Dunes of sand beneath the water form when waves and tides set grains into motion and create ripples that align with the direction of longshore drift. These ripples advance grain by grain in slow patterns that reflect the dynamic balance between wave-induced stress at the seabed and the cohesion of sand grains that resist motion until a threshold is passed. Clay between sand bodies can settle where the water is calm between tidal cycles, because fine silts that drift through the water column find low energy pockets and drop onto the floor. These cycles carried through time create laminated patterns of sand beds, mud drapes and mixed bedding that are later compressed into rock, preserving the subtle variation of shelf life. Over the course of tens of millions of years, sea level shifts move coastlines landward or seaward. When ice expands over Gondwana, sea level can drop and expose areas of former shelf as plains. When ice melts, sea level can rise and flood low coastal plains back into shallow seas. These migrations alter the zone where salty marine water meets freshwater lenses and shift where tidal flats develop without disrupting the overall presence of broad, shallow seas across much of the coastal realm. Rivers that empty toward these shores carve deltas, but delta detail remains reserved for later inner zones. So here these rivers are simply the source of water that carries minerals and grains toward shelves. The presence of terrestrial vegetation in equatorial belts influences the chemistry of runoff because plants draw nutrients from soil and then return some fraction through decay. This mixing of land-derived organic matter with mineral sediment and dissolved ions helps maintain productivity in coastal waters. Along some tropical to subtropical shelf areas, carbonate organisms can produce skeletal platelets, spicules, shell fragments, and even compound constructions that become carbonate platforms and banks over time, though the scale of shelf description remains broad and avoids reef spectacle. These carbonate materials settle quietly and mix with clay and silt to form composite beds that can alternate in texture, depending on the relative strength of biological production at different times. In regions near volcanic arcs, small shards of erupted ash appear in sediment beds, and because ash dissolves more readily than quartz or feldspar grains, it becomes sites for clay mineral formation. This process can seed smectite or other clay types across the floor of these shelves. Where topography rises to create peninsulas or offshore islands, the shelf margin is broken into smaller embayments and narrow passages that allow water exchange. In such places, the seafloor has irregular pockets, where deposits can be thick in protected alcoves and thin in open reaches. These patterns reflect the balance between wave energy basin shape and sediment supply. Along the southern high-latitude shores that are influenced by cold air over ice-covered Gondwana, colder surface water can plunge down the shelf gradient and generate slow, bottom-hugging flows that push fine grains seaward. These bottom currents carry clay-rich sediment out to deeper water, where it settles in layers that mark the presence of cold sources and high-latitude conditions. Seasonal temperature patterns in mid and low latitudes change the thickness of the warm surface layer slightly across shelves, and those changes influence how nutrients and oxygen mix. During warm intervals, stronger stratification can limit mixing and promote accumulation of organic particles beneath the surface. During cooler intervals, weak stratification allows deeper exchange and buries organic matter further into the seafloor. The shell debris of creatures that graze plankton can accumulate in tremendous numbers in clear, shallow water and blanket large areas of shelf with carbonate mud mixed with skeletal fragments. Through gradual burial, those remains convert into limestone over long spans of time. In contrast, clastic shelves that lie opposite river mouths store quartz, rich sands and feldspar silt, and the mixture of those grains can narrow channels or build tidal bars that rework sediment in repeated cycles. Shelf width near the equator can exceed tens to hundreds of kilometers, particularly where low-lying continental margin slopes extend far seaward, whereas at some convergent margins, shelves are narrow because mountains rise close to the coastline and their flanks descend quickly into deeper water. In all cases, this region is a gateway where land influences marine processes and where the sea begins to taste the chemistry of continental material. The shelves form a continuous contact zone between Pangaea and the global hydrosphere, a band where energy dissipates, matter is exchanged, and sediment drifts downward in silence, preserving the quiet record of coastal proximity and the steady breathing of land and sea through the long union of the supercontinent. One step farther inward from the continental shelf, the low flat coasts of equatorial Pangaea open into humid belts where forests of leucopsids seed ferns and early conifers gather in broad coal swamp lowlands, and these forests rise from soils that are saturated for much of the year because groundwater sits near the surface, and slow-moving distributary channels do not cut deeply into the sediment. In these settings, the land is neither marine nor dry interior, but lies in an intermediate world of shallow basins, levees, floodplains, and quiet ponds, where organic matter accumulates faster than it can decay under waterlogged conditions. Trees stand tall with trunks that can reach many tens of meters, supported by tissues that evolved in earlier Paleozoic forests, and their crowns form layered canopies in which air remains humid, warm and still, because wind that sweeps across shelves loses momentum once it moves into the shelter of dense vegetation. The ground beneath these forests contains mats of roots that knit sediment and peat into coherent layers, and each season the slow shedding of leaves, bark, spores and rootlets feeds the peat surface with carbon-rich debris. Over time, the balance between plant production and decay tips toward accumulation, because oxygen is limited in the water-soaked soil, and because microbes cannot break down cellulose and lignin quickly in such conditions. These lowland forests line equatorial belts of Pangaea, where warm air interacts with year-round evaporation, and frequent rainfall maintains high soil moisture. River channels that drain basins upstream move through these forests in multiple threads that split and rejoin, forming anabranching patterns that leave islands of trees between channels and create natural levees of sand that stand only modestly above the waterlogged floor. During flood pulses that can span weeks, fresh sheets of sediment spread across the forest floor and bury newly fallen plant remains. When floodwaters retreat, the ground is reset with new layers of silt and clay, and shallow pools remain behind as isolated pockets that persist until evaporation or renewed flow refreshes them. Arthropods in these forests include giant millipede relatives whose long segmented bodies move in slow waves across the peat surface, their exoskeletons reflecting ambient light. They feed on decaying plant matter and break coarse debris into finer fragments that further accelerate peat formation by making plant remains more accessible to microbes. Dragonfly relatives with large wingspans glide through humid air above quiet open spaces in the forest. Their flight is mediated by steady wing beats. These insect lineages developed flight earlier in the Paleozoic and continue to occupy these humid environments because abundant prey exists in the form of smaller arthropods that thrive where plant biomass is high. Amphibians rest near root buttresses or along channel margins. Their bodies depend on moist environments because their skin allows gas exchange. They hunt in small pools and along muddy banks, and although their presence adds to the living complexity of these forests, the narrative keeps description calm. Early reptiles also move through this setting. They lay eggs on land and do not require water for reproduction in the same manner as amphibians, so they represent an evolutionary shift toward terrestrial independence. Some dwell in leaf litter, where the forest floor is dry enough at certain times to allow them to move without constant immersion. The peat that develops in these forests is a feature of global significance, because later burial under sand and silt compaction and gentle heating will eventually change peat into coal. Coal formation in these forest belts is a logical consequence of high plant productivity and low decay rates. In the present time of this description, the peat surface remains soft and wet, with layers that build year by year. River channels that occasionally avulse during large flood years can shift into new paths and leave behind abandoned channels that fill with standing water. Those water-filled hollows host thick mats of floating vegetation and dead plant fragments. As spores settle out of the air, They imprint themselves into thin films that become part of the accumulating record. Floors of these forests vary in topography only by small vertical differences because the land surface is controlled by the water table. Slight rises form along natural levees where overbanked sand accumulates. Slight depressions form where channels abandon their beds. Forest vegetation colonizes these subtle gradients with different plant types that respond to water availability. Seed ferns grow in slightly drier patches. Lycopsids dominate wetter ground. Conifers, though present, are not the main canopy form in these equatorial belts at this time. Fungal decomposers live in the soil and slowly consume plant matter, but their rate is limited by low oxygen. They help build humic gel that binds organic particles together. Rain falls frequently in this area because equatorial bands of rising air encourage convection, and because the supercontinent's size creates broad monsoon-like circulations along coastal belts. When moist air flows inland over these swamp forests, it cools slightly and releases rainfall, adding water to soils already near saturation. There is no flashy storm depiction here. It is simply a climatological result of the geography and the physics of moist air. The ground remains soft. Tree trunks anchor themselves with broad bases. Their fall leaves behind cavities in the peat. Sometimes forest floors collapse slightly where organic matter beneath them has decomposed or compacted. That subsidence allows water to flood more deeply and encourages new peat to accumulate. In coastal reaches of these forests, the influence of the sea can appear as brackish water during certain high tides or during sea level high stands when seawater infiltrates inland. But here in the heart of the coal belts, the influence of land-derived fresh water dominates. Watercolour is dark with dissolved humic substances. As years pass, resin and durable plant structures become entombed within the peat and survive to deeper burial. Some forests stand near lake-sized basins whose margins shift in response to small fluctuations in base level. Shoreline vegetation in such settings grows thick across mud-rich ground. Insects lay eggs in moist leaves and stems. Amphibians attach their eggs to submerged plant stalks. Reptiles use slightly higher patches of land to lay eggs in soil that is aerated enough to incubate them. The surface of Pangaea between shelves and interiors thus includes these broad coal swamp systems in equatorial regions, and those coal swamp systems represent a distinct intermediate layer in the outward to inward path because they are neither the landward margin of marine water nor the interior arid belts of later layers, but instead the humid forests where organic accumulation builds one slow, thin sheet at a time, and where the supercontinent breathes carbon into the future rock record of the Earth. Above the forest canopies of these equatorial coal swamps, the air remains warm, damp, and layered with stillness, and in this quiet air the arthropods of the late Paleozoic find steady buoyancy and broad room to move. Giant millipede relatives progress across the forest floor in slow waves of synchronous leg strokes. Their bodies low and elongated, their weight borne by many repeated supports that distribute their mass across the peat. Close to the surface of shallow ponds where silt settles in soft drapes, aquatic larvae feed in dark water and emerge into the still atmosphere as winged adults that take advantage of these humid sky corridors. Among them are dragonfly relatives that have large wingspans relative to their bodies, and in this warm medium they glide between emergent stems and the upper forest crown, with smooth deceleration and gentle tracking of air currents that form inside this stratified atmosphere. Air currents remain shallow because dense vegetation weakens momentum, and the humid microclimate inside these forests reduces the vertical mixing that would otherwise create gusts and turbulence. The scale of these animals is part of the physics of this time. High oxygen in the late Paleozoic atmosphere supports diffusion through the tracheal system of arthropods, without requiring lungs or circulatory adjustments to deliver gases to internal tissues, and because oxygen has a larger partial pressure than in later times at sea level, arthropods can sustain larger body sizes without losing metabolic efficiency. This does not create spectacle here. It simply enables an airspace in which these giant millipede relatives and large dragonfly kin exist as stable parts of daily forest life. Their presence is quiet. Their wing beats do not need to be rapid to support flight, and their bodies maintain balance with slow adjustments. In shaded patches between large trunks, some arthropods make burrows that dip downward into humic mud. These burrows host a range of small detritivores and predators that occupy niche spaces beneath the litter layer. The floor is not a uniform peat sheet, but a mix of shallow, open water, buttress root platforms, leaf mats, and occasional bare patches where fresh floods scoured away the soft organic veneer, exposing mineral silt brought in by flood pulses upstream. In areas where treefall opens small skylights, the vegetation below receives more sunlight than normal, and such gaps in the canopy enable a thicker growth of low plants, spores and juvenile trees. Arthropods use these openings to warm themselves in early daylight and adjust their body positions to maintain thermal comfort. In the heart of these forests, even during calm daylight, the air carries fine, suspended moisture that can condense on the wings of perched insects. When humidity becomes too high, some insects hold their wings in positions that reduce moisture deposition. Moisture influences both light scattering and scent dispersion, and scent trails used by some ground-dwelling arthropods are more persistent in saturated air than in dry interior air. Millipede relatives that graze decaying plant matter contribute to peat formation by fragmenting large woody debris into manageable sizes that bacteria and fungi can process. Their feeding trails create small micro-ridges which can trap spores and plant fragments. These trails, though tiny compared to the scale of rivers, become part of the layered peat fabric, recorded as subtle differences in organic texture that eventually contribute to coal structure. Dragonfly relatives patrol above surface pools and hover near leaf-shadowed ponds where smaller winged insects cluster for reproduction. Their flight mechanics depend on the geometry of wing veins and on the rotational control of each wing pair, and these mechanics were refined many tens of millions of years before this time. Their presence here is a continuation of earlier Paleozoic evolutionary progress. Amphibians hunt among emergent roots, but in this section they remain peripheral because the framing stays in the atmospheric space between canopy and forest floor, not on the bank of a channel and not beneath water. Air above the canopy is not uniform in temperature. When sunlight heats the treetops, a thin warm layer accumulates and expands slightly, and a small density gradient forms that encourages faint upward drift. That drift sometimes carries spores and fine plant debris into higher parts of the canopy. These drifting particles move slowly downward again when the day cools. Reptiles cross low branches and appear on logs at the edge of open pools. Their lungs allow them to hold internal oxygen storage in ways amphibia cannot, but from this vantage their appearance is only part of the broad continuum between the air and the peat. The composition of these coal swamp air masses varies over small distances because decomposition of organic matter releases carbon dioxide and methane into local pockets, and because vegetation cycles water vapor through stomata. The breathing of the forest floor and the transpiration of the canopy influence the boundary layer properties, so that in any given small space, air carries the signature of its immediate surroundings. In this thickly vegetated environment, the distribution of light becomes variable. Understory receives less direct light, and some arthropods prefer high contrast edges, where a beam of filtered sunlight intersects shadow. Insects sometimes orient their bodies at angles that reduce silhouette exposure. Meanwhile, fungal columns grow in shaded recesses, breaking lignin and cellulose in slow metabolic work. The slow pace of breakdown ensures the persistence of woody fragments that mix with new plant debris every season. The air above the forest witnesses pollen, grains and spores that migrate from tree to tree or from clump to clump by small air motions and settle in waterlogged hollows. When rain falls, canopy drops partition it into droplets that descend as small beads, striking broad leaves and producing repeating patterns of splash and wetting that do not become violent at this narrative scale. The drops carry fine silt washed from the trunks of trees and deposit that silt in pools at the base of root networks. Millipedes retreat slightly into crevices when rainfall persists too long, and dragonfly relatives perch with wings extended to dry again when rainfall stops. As day gives way to evening, temperature gradients soften, and the contrast between canopy and understory shrinks. In that time, the vertical drift of spores begins to slow, and the air becomes uniform again. Night humidity rises further, and early morning dew can form on leaves and on the wings of perched insects before they take flight. Across these equatorial belts, the combination of warmth, humidity, and oxygen, rich air forms a spatial layer that holds both arthropods and flying vertebrates at stable metabolic ranges. This atmospheric world remains a signature of the late Paleozoic. Its structure stems directly from its place on a supercontinent with near global ocean on the outside and peat-forming forest belts inside. It is a layer in the outward to inward path of Pangaea. During this interval, situated between the broad lowland vegetation surface and the higher pressure of drier continental interiors still farther inside. Among the quiet surfaces of these coal swamp lowlands, small reptiles move between patches of leaf litter, across exposed silt, and onto the raised surfaces of roots. Their bodies are scaled, and their limbs hold them clear of saturated soil in a way amphibians cannot sustain for long, because these reptiles have skin that resist water loss more effectively, and eggs that develop within membranes that do not require free water for fertilization. In these forested belts, they occupy a thin spatial layer just above the peat surface, and they walk among networks of fungi arthropod trails, small depressions filled with humic water and low branches, where seed ferns hang fronds that shed fragments into the organic bed. The presence of these reptiles marks a change in terrestrial ecosystems because they use land as their primary environment rather than as an extension of shallow water. They feed on small insects' larvae and soft-bodied prey that live in the moist litter of the understory. They move with patient steps among the roots because the forest floor is uneven and thick with organic matter. Tiny lacework of veins in fallen leaves define stable microsubstrate for their footfalls. Their skulls and teeth are shaped for gripping and biting, not for filter feeding or bulk plant consumption. They breathe air through lungs rather than relying on cutaneous exchange. These traits blend with the warm and humid environment to allow them to remain active in belts, where amphibians must retreat into water. On slopes of natural levees near the water's edge, reptiles bask in faint sunlight that reaches through breaks in the canopy. On raised patches of peat that have not been recently flooded, they nest in soil that holds enough aeration to incubate eggs. When they lay eggs, their success depends upon whether soil pore spaces remain open long enough to supply oxygen. Microbial respiration around the eggs consumes oxygen slowly, and in waterlogged areas the oxygen may decline too much, so reptiles often prefer slightly elevated ground for nesting. On these raised patches, decaying vegetation also creates heat through microbial metabolism, and that small heat flux can influence incubation temperatures. Newly hatched reptiles are small and mobile, ready to forage on their own in understory where arthropods are abundant. The forest floor is patterned by the models of leaf fall. When leaves fall, they create local shade gradients. These gradients influence the distribution of smaller invertebrates. Reptiles detect prey partly by movement cues and partly by chemical signals released into damp air that flows across their senses. Some reptiles in this time possess openings in their skulls behind the eyes that allow more efficient placement of jaw muscles and permit mechanical efficiency in prey capture. Their bite force can crush the exoskeleton of prey insects or small arthropods with ease. When they hunt, their postures are low and close to the ground because that is where prey is most available. The carbon cycle of these swamp forests is therefore influenced by reptiles indirectly. When reptiles eat arthropods or larvae, they remove some fraction of decomposer biomass, and that can slightly alter how litter decays. Where reptiles are abundant, there may be less shredding of coarse plant debris by insects, and that difference can slightly slow the breakdown of woody matter. But these differences play out over long periods and are stored in the peat as subtle differences in organic texture rather than as visible structures. The distribution of reptiles in these forests changes in response to water fluctuations. When rain increases, wet patches expand and reptiles avoid the deepest mud. When the ground dries slightly, they venture farther. Rivers that meander through these forests can change their course. When a new channel develops, reptiles can be displaced for a brief time while the flood pulse passes. They will then return when the channel stabilizes. Their home ranges are small compared to the river basin. They do not require the wide travel of large vertebrates. The forest is enough. In these belts of Pangaea, large vertebrates do not dominate the ground. Amphibians and reptiles and arthropods dominate the biomass of terrestrial animals. The locomotion of small reptiles is stable because their limb posture holds their bellies above the ground, reducing drag against vegetation. This advantage signals an important evolutionary shift from amphibian sprawled states into more efficient terrestrial mobility. On dry patches, reptiles can move faster than amphibians. In bright conditions, reptiles may bask to raise body temperature to levels favourable for digestion and locomotion. When clouds pass or evening approaches, reptiles seek shelter among roots logs or small cavities near peat surface to avoid heat loss. The daily routine of these animals follows sunlight because reptilian metabolism is sensitive to temperature. A reptile that has fed will often rest to digest, storing heat within its body until the food is processed. Along small water bodies, insect swarms gather as tiny points of prey. As the day warms, some reptiles climb low branches where their claws anchor to rough surfaces and they wait for prey to appear. They hold motionless for long periods. The humid air holds scents close to the forest floor. When a reptile exhales, its breath is saturated with water vapor and mixes with ambient air that is equally moist. Because oxygen levels in this era are high for the Paleozoic metabolic requirements, are satisfied at lower ventilatory rates, and these animals remain quiet. The concept of predators and prey is present here only as a relationship of energy flow, not as dramatic action. The swamps are peaceful. The accumulation of plant matter into peat continues year over year. The burial of organic debris forms layers in which reptile tracks, casts of their bellies, or even shallow resting impressions can be preserved if immediately buried by fine sediment. The legacy of these small terrestrial reptiles thus becomes part of the record that will later compress into coal. Where trunks fall and rot in place, The remnants may serve as scaffolds on which reptiles climb, or as bridges that allow movement across semi-submerged areas. Some conifer seed structures may fall to the ground and become food for arthropods, which then become food for reptiles. Even though seed plants are increasing in diversity, flowering plants are not yet present in this interval. The pollen of these seed plants is transported in the air by subtle currents and may adhere to reptile scales temporarily. In some locations, the air carries clouds of spores and pollen grains that drift downward in slow settling. The reptiles simply exist within this rain of microscopic matter, touching it, carrying it briefly and releasing it into the litter. In this world of coal swamp forests, the terrestrial vertebrate ecology is marked by reptiles that have full capability to lay eggs on land and to support terrestrial living. This life zone within these humid forests marks an important interior step from the outer shelf realms into the core of Pangaea. Farther inward from these humid equatorial forests, the rivers that receive rainfall, flood pulses and groundwater return build broad deltic plains that spread toward the sea in low gradients of sediment, and these plains constitute a transitional world where land meets shallow coastal water, but where the influence of the continent is stronger than the influence of the open ocean. In these places, river mouths are not single channels, but braided or distributary networks of multiple shallow passages that wander across their own deposits and carve or abandon routes depending on which thread becomes dominant in a given decade or century. Sediment comes from upstream basins that include the coal swamp forests already described, and also from more distant catchments that drain uplands far to the interior, and it arrives at the delta front as mixtures of sand, silt and clay that have been sorted by currents during transport. As flow slows when it meets standing or slowly circulating coastal water, coarser grains fall out sooner and settle near channel mouths, while finer particles travel farther and settle in quieter water beyond the immediate river plume. Once deposited, this sediment is reworked by tides and by subtle longshore drift that moves suspended grains parallel to the shoreline in a gentle process controlled by wave angle and the orientation of the coast. Because the coastline of Pangaea extends for immense distances, these deltas are not concentrated in one place, but appear as long chains of low-lying sedimentary wedges that arc around broad embayments and irregular continental bays. Vegetation takes hold in many of these deltas where the ground is stable enough to support roots, but still wet enough to discourage decay, and low-lying stands of seed ferns and early conifers anchor fine sediment with mats of roots, while clay-filled interdistributary bays host marsh-like vegetation that thrives in shallow water. The mosaic of freshwater, brackish water and marine water changes through time because sea level is not fixed, and because the late Paleozoic Ice Age modulates ocean volume and thus shoreline position. During intervals when ice expands on Gondwana, the ocean withdraws slightly, exposing parts of the delta plain to air and oxidation, allowing soils to form over previously submerged sediments. When ice melts, sea level rises again, and marine water floods inland, pushing the delta front toward the interior drowning parts of the vegetated plain and depositing new layers of sediment over soils that had only recently formed. This back and forth of shoreline position leaves thin alternations of brackish mud, freshwater peat, and oxidized soil profiles within the stratigraphy of the deltas. In this steady narrative, the emphasis is not on sudden shifts, but on the long cumulative effect of repeated small transgressions and regressions. Where river mouths diverge into multiple distributary channels, each channel competes for sediment supply. Channels that capture more water deepen slightly relative to their neighbours, while those that lose discharge gradually fill with silt and clay and become abandoned. In these abandoned channels, shallow lakes form and vegetation spreads into these lakes, weaving roots through soft sediment. The roots bind particles together and create mats strong enough to support early reptiles when the ground near the surface dries seasonally. Within interdistributary bays, the water remains opaque with suspended clay for long intervals, and when that clay settles, it forms thin laminae that record every quiet day of deposition. Where waves sweep across the front of the delta plain during calm conditions, they rework sand into low bars that migrate laterally. These bars can merge or break apart depending on local hydraulic conditions, and as they shift, they redirect flow into new distributaries or away from old ones. This constant, slow reshaping does not create spectacle. It is simply the natural operation of river and coastal water interacting across gentle slopes. The air above these delta plains is humid in low latitudes and seasonally variable in higher latitudes. Evaporation from standing water increases humidity during warm intervals, and that humidity influences local rainfall patterns. That rain feeds the rivers, and the rivers feed the deltas. The cycle is continuous through long spans of late Carboniferous and Permian time. Clay that settles on the delta plain is derived not only from mechanical breakdown of continental rocks, but also from chemical weathering in humid interior belts. That clay contains the imprint of plant litter breakdown and of ions leached from soil. When mixed with silt and fine sand and buried over time, it becomes mud rock that documents repeated transitions from freshwater to brackish water environments. In some places, early conifers grow near slightly elevated ground, at the apex of the delta, where channels join to form the trunk of the river. These locations lie higher in the floodplain and provide sites where reptiles can lay eggs in soil that is moist but not saturated. Where distributary channels shift suddenly during flood pulses, the direction of flow can rearrange sand bodies over distances of hundreds of meters. These pulses deliver coarse sediment to the delta front, where the sand spreads into fans that prograde seaward. When floodwater recedes, the land remains wet and suspended. Clay settles in quiet bays and lakes. Thick organic mats accumulate in some areas where decomposition remains slow, and those mats contribute to peat that will be buried and eventually produce thin coal seams interbedded with delta muds. Amphibians take advantage of shallow pools behind levees to spawn. Their larvae grow in still water among floating leaves and stems. When those pools dry, they retreat toward channels. When the channels shift, they must adjust or perish. Their bones, if buried, can become part of the delta record. Water chemistry in delta plains differs from water chemistry in coal swamp interiors because dissolved salt from marine incursions can penetrate into some distributary bays. This salinity gradient supports different assemblages of small organisms. In areas of higher salinity, small mollusks or shelled creatures related to brachiopods may appear in brackish zones. Their fragments can accumulate in thin lenses of shelly debris. In fresher zones, shelly components are sparser. Carbonate production may occur in some shallow brackish reaches, but remains limited compared to fully marine carbonate platforms farther offshore. Over the span of tens of millions of years, these delta plains march landward and seaward, many times each shift leaving a thin surface of oxidation or a layer of brackish mud or a veneer of sand from storm waves. The cumulative sum forms complex sediment bodies that record the presence of rivers near the coast during the time when Pangaea remains unified. These delta plains are therefore an intermediate inner layer between the humid coal swamp forests and the more inland interior belts of dryness that lie still farther toward the center of the continent. In this zone, water movement is governed by gentle slopes, sediment supply, and the balance between freshwater flow and marine influence. and because of these controls, the deltic plains remain a broad transitional landscape, whose geometry evolves slowly while Pangaea remains whole. As distance from the river mouths and delta plains increases and the path continues across low coastal flanks of Pangaea, seasonal contrasts in rainfall begin to imprint a broad domain that can be understood as monsoon-influenced belts, where the location on a near-global landmass causes large annual swings in moisture that depend on which side of the year the subsolar point rests over these latitudes. Land that stretches unbroken for thousands of kilometers enhances this pattern because air that flows from ocean toward land carries latent heat and water vapor. When the continent is warmer than the sea, and when the continent cools more strongly in another season, the same air mass can return to the ocean with lower moisture content. Because continental interiors heat and cool more strongly than water, these coastal flanks live on the boundary between the moderating superocean Panthalassa and the thermally responsive interior of the contiguous landmass. The outcome is a belt-wide seasonal rhythm that is not violent here, but rather shows itself as broad zonation of vegetation density and soil moisture. During times when the sun's path brings stronger illumination to these coasts, the land warms more quickly than the sea, and air drawn inland from the superocean or from the Tethys realm rises as it crosses hot ground. As it rises, it cools, and the cooling pushes water vapor into condensation over very large areas. Rain falls not in explosive bursts, but a sustained seasonal supply that wets soils and supports particular plant lineages more strongly than at other times of the year. The water from this seasonal rainfall replenishes aquifers, fills shallow basins, and encourages vegetation that can root more deeply in mud. Rivers increase their discharge, freshwater lenses in shallow coastal embayments, expand, and broad areas of near coastal plain hold shallow standing water, only centimeters deep but wide enough to influence soil chemistry. In times when solar heating decreases and the interior cools, this belt dries. Air that was once convecting toward the land now flows seaward gently. Soil moisture drops. Shallow ponds shrink to hard mud surfaces. Evaporation draws water upward from deeper pore spaces. In these drier phases, vegetation becomes thinner than in wet periods. During the wet season, some seed ferns and early conifers produce new flushes of spores or pollen that take advantage of moisture for establishment. During the dry season, spore production can slow. Many root mats survive by drawing water stored at depth. This seasonal cycle does not pivot on storm spectacle, but on the aerodynamic reality of a supercontinent, where the land mass modulates pressure fields in annual cadence. When the sun is high and heating is strong, the low-level air drawn off the ocean supplies enough water to cover entire regions in warm rain. When the sun retreats, dryness pushes through. This dryness is not the deep aridity of dune fields farther interior. It is transitional dryness modulated by proximity to the sea. Biomass shifts accordingly. Some plants maintain evergreen foliage. Others shed stems or leaves to conserve resources. Within this belt, ephemeral channels form parallel to the coast. These channels carry pulses of surface water into shallow depressions, and then vanish as water is lost to evaporation or infiltration. Where water stands longer in low spots, microbial life continues to work on organic debris from earlier wet intervals, producing humic gels that darken soils and bind fine minerals into cohesive aggregates. Marine influence appears in some coastal indentations where tidal effects bring saltier water into narrow inlets, but the soil away from direct tidal reach remains largely freshwater in composition. Inland of these tidal notches, the zone of monsoon influence can stretch for great distances depending on local geography. The line dividing more persistent wetness from more persistent dryness shifts in latitude over tens of millions of years as sea levels adjust and as the geometry of Pangaea evolves. However, the essence of the belt remains the same: repeated seasonal contrasts driven by the difference in heat capacity between the land and the sea. Animals that occupy this belt move along moisture gradients in subtle patterns. Amphibians may find sufficient water for reproduction during the wet phase, but struggle in dry intervals. Reptiles retain advantage because they are not tied to permanent standing water. They remain near soft ground as long as prey remains available. Insects track the seasonal cycle because moisture influences larval survival. They lay eggs in damp substrates during wet phases. When the ground dries, the larvae that survive must shelter in remaining pockets of muddy sediment. When the wet season returns, emergent adults take flight and populate the air over low coastal flats. The soil itself carries chemical signatures of these cycles. In wet intervals, leaching moves ions downward, producing faint horizons of depletion beneath the surface. In dry intervals, capillary rise brings dissolved ions upward and concentrates them near the surface. This repeated rise and fall generates patterns of mottled soil that remain subtle but persistent. Over long spans of time, these belts can produce alternating pale and dark laminae within near-surface clays that reflect episodes of wetter and drier soils. If such soils become buried under new sediment from future coastal advances or river migrations, they become stratigraphic signals of seasonal regimes in ancient Pangaea. Winds near the coast transport fine clay during dry periods and deposit it over short distances where vegetation does not cover the ground completely. These thin dust films accumulate over months and years, and their influence is visible when the wet season begins again. In the first rains, these dust layers form suspended slips that slide across the surface and then settle into small curls when flow slows. Carbon-rich patches of decaying vegetation appear after the wet pulses and feed soil microbes. Because oxygen at this time in Earth history remains higher than in many later intervals, decomposition in better aerated soils can proceed more rapidly than in waterlogged forest cores. Yet in this transitional belt, decomposition is strongly seasonal. It accelerates in drier intervals when oxygen is readily available. It slows in wetter intervals when the ground is near saturation. These rhythms govern soil organic reserves and influence how well plant roots hold the substrate. Inland subtle relief can shape local distribution of monsoon influence. Low hills reduce coastal penetration of summer moisture slightly on their lee sides. These lee sides remain drier than windward sides. Over geological durations, such differential moisture regimes can create asymmetrical patterns of soil formation across short lateral distances. All of this unfolds quietly. Nothing in this belt is sudden. The monsoon influence exists because of the geometry of a near-global landmass, and because of the physics of heat distribution between water and solid Earth. The belts that form along Pangaea's coasts thus maintain a broad intermediate world of seasonal shifts, where vegetation compresses and expands across the year, where soils breathe in moisture and then release it, and where the land signals both its contact with the superocean outside and its connection to the continental interior that lies still farther in. Farther toward the centre of Pangaea, the land loses the seasonal wet signal of the monsoon belts and spreads into broad interior, where dryness becomes the primary organising force because distance from the sea grows so large that moisture delivered from coastal sources is greatly reduced. And in this immense interior, daytime heating is strong. Nighttime cooling is strong, and annual temperature contrast widen in ways not experienced along margins where ocean-moderated cycles remain. Here rainfall is sparse, vegetation is thin, and soils form in conditions where water is limited for long spans, and the land thus supports patchworks of hardy seed ferns and isolated conifers, whose roots reach downward to find residual pockets of moisture. In some places, shallow ephemeral lakes form only when rare rain pulses arrive, and then evaporate again, leaving behind salt crusts or thin veneers of clay that crack into polygonal mosaics when they dry. The landscape stretches across near-level surfaces where the horizon remains broad and uninterrupted, and only low hills break the continuity. The air in this interior warms quickly when the sun rises and dries the soil surface rapidly, because the boundary layer is shallow in early daylight hours before convection develops. During the day, thermal contrast build, and when air lifts, new parcels of air enter from near the surface, drying the top layer of soil further. At night, the land radiates heat away under clear skies, and temperatures drop sharply. Such strong diurnal variation produces repeated physical stress cycles on the sediments of the interior, because expansion and contraction due to temperature create shallow cracks and disruption of aggregates. Clay minerals yield to these cycles, forming small grains and silt-sized particles that are loose and easily lifted by wind in dry conditions. These particles travel across many kilometers when pressure gradients allow and settle again when wind slows. This cycle of dust production and dust deposition maintains a slow but continuous drift of fine grains from areas of erosion to areas where small irregularities in topography, slow wind, and permit deposition. In these interior regions, heavy vegetation does not anchor the soil completely, so dunes can begin to accumulate where the wind collects sand-sized particles rather than clay-sized particles. These dunes can be small or large depending on sediment supply, and some extend for many kilometers at a scale not described in dunes of distributions close to modern deserts, because the geometry of a supercontinent produces larger continuous tracts of dry interior land. The orientation of the dunes can vary with prevailing winds, and wind directions can change seasonally, generating cross-bedded patterns in the sediment that reflect multiple phases of sand movement. In places where the sediment contains iron-bearing minerals, slight oxidation in wet intervals produces a reddish hue when exposed to oxygen, and this color can persist through dry intervals as an indicator of iron oxidizing reactions that occur in shallow pore spaces. When rare rains do fall across these interiors, water moves quickly across the surface because infiltration can be slow if clays swell and close their pore spaces. These rain pulses carve shallow rills that rework dust and fine sand, pushing them toward low depressions and forming thin fans at the base of slopes. The water remains surface-bound only briefly before evaporating or infiltrating where the sediment is permeable. Vegetation capable of surviving in these expanses includes conifers with root systems that reach deeper soil horizons, and seed ferns positioned around locations where slight depressions allow more moisture to linger. They do not form close canopies, but rather occupy isolated stands with open ground between them. Arthropods that colonize such dry ground tend to dwell in burrows that protect them from midday heat, and some reptiles shift their behaviors to occupy shady spots under sparse shrubs or behind small rocks. Their eggs can be laid in sand that retains enough warmth to incubate them without requiring the saturation that amphibians need. Worms and soft-bodied invertebrates survive only in microenvironments where moisture remains long enough to sustain their metabolism. In these interiors, the rocks that rise near the surface are closer to their original structural fabric than in areas where soil forms deeply. Some outcrops show the welded sutures of paleo mountain belts that formed when earlier continental fragments collided to create Pangaea. These outcrops are not yet described as specific mountains or ridges, because their structural details remain for later inward steps, but they punctuate the interior plains with hard surfaces that resist wind erosion more strongly than surrounding sediment. Where the ground remains flat for long stretches, occasional salt pans appear. These pans form when saline water concentrates in shallow depressions after rain events and evaporates, leaving behind white patches of evaporate minerals. Some of these evaporate surfaces can remain in place through many cycles because rain pulses are rare. The chemistry of the soil in this interior is dominated by oxidation salt accumulation and the formation of clay minerals through weathering and reworking of fine material originally transported from coastal flanks or formed locally by physical breakdown. Soil horizons can become calcareous in some regions due to precipitation of calcium carbonate from soil solutions that become supersaturated in dry intervals, and this precipitation forms nodules or layers that harden and cement grains together. These horizons can later become part of the rock record as calcrete or other carbonate-cemented layers. Wind can scatter plant seeds across these expanses, but only a fraction germinate because most seeds land where moisture is not sufficient. Those that do germinate survive when roots reach deep enough to find pockets of stored water left from earlier wet intervals. When they die, their remains add to the thin organic cover of the soil. In the absence of major rivers, these remains degrade slowly and are consumed by microbes in small bursts after rare moisture events. The interior dryness zone thus marks a wide and distinct realm between monsoon-influenced coasts and the yet more extreme arid environments nearer the supercontinent core. This realm declares by its features the consequences of distance from the sea and the effects of large thermal contrasts in a world where the landmass dominates the planet's surface. Over the long lifetime of Pangaea, this interior dryness zone persists in various forms, adjusted by shifts in latitude and sea level, but always present in one belt or another, because the geometry of the supercontinent ensures that large tracts of land remain too far from oceans to be kept moist for most of the year. In this belt, the quiet physics of heating, cooling, and evaporation carve the land into shapes that record the presence of a united continent spread wide beneath the Paleozoic and earliest Mesozoic sun. Still farther toward the center of the supercontinent, the interior dryness deepens into zones where dunes become the principal geomorphic expression. And these dunes are not small or isolated, but arrayed over distances so great that one field can merge imperceptibly into the next, creating a continent-scale sand sea that rises and falls in subdued ridges and hollows, shaped by wind that has travelled far over dry land with little friction. These dunes start as accumulations of sand-sized particles that are lifted by turbulent air when shear stress at ground level exceeds the threshold required to move grains. Once lifted grains travel in short hops and collide with other grains dislodging them, and this process builds a chain reaction that fills the lower atmosphere with sediment for short distances before the grains fall again. Repetition of this motion across the day moves sand upward along dune stoss slopes and deposits it near the crest until gravitational pull at the lee side exceeds the angle of stability and forces a small avalanche. Over time, these avalanches contribute to cross-bedding, and the cross-bedding geometry reflects the dominant wind direction. Because wind direction in such arid continental interiors can shift on seasonal scales, the crossbeds in some dune fields show evidence of multiple dominant wind orientations. In low latitudes, the sun warms these dunes intensely by midday, and the upper layers of sand can reach temperatures that force small animals to retreat into burrows or beneath shaded rocks. Overnight radiative cooling lowers the surface temperature sharply, and thermal gradients penetrate downward several centimeters in the upper layers. This daily cycle influences how moisture moves through dune bodies. When rare rains fall, moisture infiltrates the sand for a short distance held by capillary forces at grain contacts, However, wind quickly removes water at the surface. Once clouds pass and moisture trapped deeper in the dune slowly migrates downward by gravity. Over long intervals, such rare wetting and fast-drying leaves thin layers of cementation in places where mineral-rich, poor water precipitates small amounts of calcite or silica. These cemented lenses can stiffen the dune, locking some crossbeds into position and creating a stratigraphic signature that can endure burial far into the future. In places where ephemeral lakes form after rare storms, the lower margins of dunes can slump toward the water. When the lake evaporates, thin crusts of salts form and can break when wind returns, sending small fragments of crust into the dune field where they become new grains for entrainment. Plant life in these dune fields is sparse but not absent. Seed ferns and primitive conifers may grow in protected hollows, where moisture pools anchoring small pockets of sand with root networks. These pockets remain small and local because the water supply is insufficient to support large stands. Their presence, even minimal, is significant because the plants reduce grain mobility locally and create small shadows that can persist through dry seasons, providing conditions that influence the local thermal environment. Reptiles inhabit this zone as well. They move cautiously at dawn and dusk when surface temperatures are mild. During midday, they seek cool refuges beneath the sand or within root shadows. Their eggs can be laid in shallow pits on dune flanks where temperatures remain acceptable for development. Some arthropods burrow to depths where daily thermal swings are dampened. These animals emerge at night when cooler air moves across the dunes. The dunes themselves drift downwind slowly but persistently. During strong seasonal winds, the migration rates can increase. During calmer periods, the dunes hold still. Over thousands of years, their migration remakes entire landscapes. Where dunes accumulate against subtle ridges of stronger rock or older sediment, sand can stack upward to large heights. The colour of these dunes can shift from near white to reddish-brown if iron oxides coat the grains. These oxides form by repeated wetting and drying events. When trace moisture at grain surfaces oxidizes dissolved iron. Over geological spans, such colour changes can deepen. In some areas, precipitation from atmospheric vapour can deposit small amounts of calcium carbonate that bind grains into weak crusts. These crusts can harden temporarily and create surfaces that resist erosion briefly. When heavy dry winds return, these crusts crack. Fragments break off and new grains join the saltation chain. The dune bodies tend to migrate until they encounter obstacles. When they reach small escarpments or bedrock highs, some sand falls into hollows behind the obstructions. In those hollows, the sand may rest for longer stretches, and when rare rains arrive, finer silts can settle there. In time, those hollows can fill with finer sediments than the dune ridges. If buried under new sand or under later deposits from distant rivers, such hollows become small lenticular mud bodies preserved amidst cross-bedded sand. Trace fossils can form here when arthropods burrow or reptiles drag their tails across damp sand. In the rare times when storms bring more rain than usual, rills cut down dune faces and channel sand into temporary gullies. Those gullies fill quickly as the storms subside. Wind later reshapes the dune faces. Every dune here is both history and stillness. Each ripple is a record of near-surface shear of grain size, of moisture balance. Grain sorting changes from base to crest. Larger grains often remain near the stoss slope because they're heavier, while smaller grains ride the wind farther and deposit near the lee side or in interdune areas. Some dunes are linear because winds remain aligned for long enough spans that separate slip faces do not develop. Others are barconoid, where unidirectional winds always push from one general direction. In regions where winds change direction, Seasonally complex star dunes can form, though their morphology remains large-scale and sometimes irregular. The significance of these sand seas in the interior of Pangaea stems from the isolation of these regions from moist coastal air. Because the supercontinent is vast and because seas surround it only at great distance, air masses that originate offshore often exhaust their moisture before reaching the deep interior. Solar heating of the land dominates here. The land warms quickly and dries the air. In this realm, the dune fields become the central expression of landscape, because vegetation cannot fully stabilize the surface. The dunes can move for tens to hundreds of kilometers over long spans of time, responding to small changes in climate and wind. They exist as a quiet record of physical processes in a world where the land itself is the primary reservoir of heat. These dune fields remain an essential interior expression of Pangaea. They are the logical continuation of increasingly dry belts as one steps inward. Their geometry testifies to the reality that a world unified into one supercontinent must contain vast stretches of land too far from the sea to be moist. Here dryness extends into substance. Here the wind sculpts the land. Across millions of years the dunes shift. Their record becomes crossbeds. Those crossbeds eventually become part of lithified rock. And those rocks later reveal how the interior of Pangaea once absorbed sunlight through uninterrupted blue skies over dunes that rolled in gentle arcs toward horizons that remained unbroken for thousands of kilometers in every direction. Beyond the broad dune seas, the ground gradually rises into uplands and mountain belts that formed long before this moment in late Paleozoic geography, when continental fragments met one another and sutured as Pangaea assembled. And although these uplands stand as interior heights, their slopes are not imagined here as jagged or precipitous peaks in cinematic form, but as long consolidated highlands with broad backs of rock that tilt against the plains with steady rise where sediment supply decreases because drainage divides begin on ridge crests rather than on low ground. These uplands are the remains of orogenies that welded crust together, and their internal fabrics contain faults folds and metamorphic zones that trace the direction of ancient collision, yet at the visible surface. In this interval, the highlands reveal themselves through stripped soil profiles, thin vegetation, and the presence of exposed bedrock shoulders, because water is not abundant enough here to hold thick soils. On windward margins, small patches of conifers and seed ferns can still grow where occasional moisture from storm tracks brushes the outermost flanks. But interior faces of the uplands shed water swiftly, and whatever trickles down the slope tends to infiltrate or evaporate before it can carve deep canyons. So what persists are long gradients that feed ephemeral channels, which descend the highlands only in pulses after rare rains. The ground on these heights warms quickly during the day because the air is thin and vegetation sparse, and each rock surface absorbs sunlight directly. At night, the same surfaces cool efficiently by radiation. This alternation stresses the outer millimeters of mineral grains and contributes to physical weathering by expansion and contraction. Over spans that exceed any human scale, such thermal weathering breaks rock into angular fragments that accumulate at the base of slopes as talus. In some places, thin snowfields might form in high southern latitudes when seasonal extremes permit freezing, but those snowfields are not persistent through the entire year, because this section occurs before the true poleward glaciation belts at the far south, so only the coldest seasons paint patches of transient snow upon these interior heights. Their melting contributes small pulses of meltwater that run downslope for brief periods. These melt pulses do not carve dramatic valleys. Instead, they wet patches of soil along their path and then vanish their water consumed by evaporation. When the wind sweeps across these uplands, it accelerates over ridge crests and buffets the rock surfaces with grains that have been carried from the dune belts below. Those airborne grains sandblast rock faces slowly. Where resistant rock stands, the wind creates ventifacts that have facets shaped by abrasion. In less resistant rock grains strip away the outer surface in thin films. In geological time, the highlands become stripped of weak material, leaving ribs and ledges that align with bedding or foliation, inherited from ancient orogenies. These structures are visible at the surface as planar weaknesses where fragments can detach along old compressional fabrics. In a few places, steep enough slopes exist where colluvial processes dominate, and gravity draws loose fragments downward. Such colluvial fans overlap one another at the foot of slopes and form wedges of angular gravel and sand that can later be cemented by groundwater circulation into breccias or coarse sandstones. These fans intercept occasional water pulses and store small amounts of moisture deep within their pore spaces. That moisture allows limited microbial colonization or temporary root anchoring by hardy plants that germinate in favourable windows. The highlands support sparse fauna. Reptiles may climb onto sunlit rock shelves to warm themselves early in the day. Their movement is slow but precise because exposed rock offers little cover from sudden cooling. Arthropods occupy cracks in the bedrock, sheltering from midday extremes of temperature. They forage only briefly in cooler hours. Seeds that drift from lower regions sometimes lodge in crevices. Most do not germinate. Those that do form isolated sprigs of vegetation that cling to pockets of loam. In rain pulses, runoff slides across flat rock surfaces without absorbing deeply because soil is thin. Thin bands of clay can accumulate in hollows. These clay beds can capture wind-blown dust that aggregates into thin crusts. When those crusts dry, they crack into polygonal patterns. This pattern is similar to those in interior dryness zones, but on uplands, chemical alteration is more influenced by oxidation of iron in bedrock fragments than by salt concentration. On some slopes, the bedrock is metamorphosed, containing minerals that formed under high pressure and temperature in deep convergence zones hundreds of millions of years earlier. Such minerals include mica and feldspar variants that reveal the thermal history of the crust. On other slopes, the rock is sedimentary, laid down in oceans or rivers, before the continents collided, then uplifted and folded into position. The break between these lithologies marks suture zones. In the Permian portions of these highlands, erosion slowly exhumed lower crustal levels that now stand at the surface. The top of the highlands can form plains where rocks have weathered into broad, moderately inclined platforms, and on these surfaces a mica glitter might show faintly in sunlight. In warm daylight hours, strong convection over the heated highlands can pull air upward. That air can then descend on the lee side, producing small pockets of downward wind that increase dryness there. This gives lee slopes slightly different vegetation composition from windward slopes. Lower moisture means reduced soil formation, and therefore loose grains develop across lee surfaces. Those loose grains can be mobilized by wind and become temporary dunes on ridge tops. These ridgetop dunes differ from the Great Dune Seas because they are localized and ephemeral. In deeper hollows within the highlands, short-lived springs may appear if recent rainfall or snowmelt saturates deeper bedrock fractures. These springs can create tiny patches of wet ground that persist for weeks. When they dry, their mud surfaces preserve trackways of small animals that visited the water. Over time, repeated cycles of frost and thaw or heat and cold can fragment rock in those hollows, more rapidly generating microdebris that contributes to fine sediment that washes downslope in later rain pulses. The overall effect of these highlands is to mark an inward transition, where interior dryness finds expression in elevation rather than in sand seas alone. Here the geometry of convergent crust persists, not yet erased by erosion. The highlands stand as memory of the assembly of Pangaea rising above the inland flats. They control drainage because water must choose one side of a ridge or the other, flowing faintly toward monsoon-influenced flanks or toward dune fields. They form a quiet barrier to moisture, forcing air to climb or fall, and in doing so they help define the pattern of interior dryness. Across millions of years, these highlands lose elevation slowly. Rivers cutting outward to marginal basins sequester sediment far from these heights. Dust blown from dune fields accumulates in depressions atop ridges, where it mixes with clay formed by in situ weathering. These temporary soils form only thin membranes. They support very small vegetation patches that contribute little biomass compared to coastal forests or swamps. Yet their existence records that even in the heart of the supercontinent, water can persist briefly within sheltered fractures, and that rock born in mountain building events of deep geological antiquity continues to present itself at the surface as a structural layer of the continent. These highlands remain part of the outward to inward sequence because they capture the intermediate zone between vast sand seas and the deeper interior where bedrock exposures will dominate. They present a realm where dryness meets elevation, where rock rises into the atmosphere and signals that the crust itself has been shaped by collisions that brought together the continents of Pangaea into a single world of land. In the next inward step beyond these broad uplands, the cover of soil and loose sediment becomes still thinner, and bedrock emerges directly at the surface as the dominant material expression, and the crust that once lay deep beneath oceans or mountain roots stands exposed to sunlight, air, and long spans of weathering. In these central exposures there is little to soften the geometry of the rock, because vegetation is sparse and clings only in shallow crevices where the tiniest films of soil collect, and because water moves briefly and vanishes again, the ground holds almost no veneer to protect the stone beneath. Here the bedrock itself becomes the ground surface. In some places the rock is massive and crystalline, containing minerals that formed in high-temperature, high-pressure regimes, and their coarse interlocking crystals testify to their origin in magmas that cooled slowly deep inside the crust long before the continents joined. In other areas the bedrock is metamorphosed from older sedimentary or igneous units and displays fabrics of fine lamination or foliation imparted by deformation, where the structure of these rocks carries the memory of ancient compression. Elsewhere, sedimentary layers laid down in oceans or on earlier floodplains stand nearly intact as stone, though hardened far beyond the original deposits. Their horizontal beds testify to deposition in quiet water before uplift and erosion stripped away the overburden. Lithological contrasts become obvious where one unit resists erosion better than the next. Hard rocks stand in relief while weaker layers waste away. Over millions of years, such contrasts produce benches, steps, and ridges aligned with bedding planes or with foliation in metamorphosed units. At this interior vantage land remains dry, and wind sweeps over surfaces that have almost no buffer. Thermal cycles of heating and cooling in a diurnal pattern expand and contract the outermost few millimeters of the rock each day. These thermal stresses propagate into microfractures, and when water from rare precipitation events infiltrate such fractures and later evaporate salts, can precipitate and push apart the mineral grains a fraction more. Microcycles repeated thousands of times advance the disassembly of hard surfaces, and flakes sprawl off the rock face in tiny increments. Angular slabs accumulate at the foot of gentle slopes, forming aprons of debris that remain until the next pulse of rare rainfall washes a portion of them downslope. No deep soils build here because organic matter is minimal, and microbial activity progresses slowly in such dry environments. Windblown dust that arrives from surrounding deserts or from the eroded flanks of the upland settles as a faint film across bedrock surfaces during brief wet intervals that dust cement slightly, but in subsequent drying cycles these thin crusts crack and peel, leaving behind a mosaic of ephemeral coatings. Rock mineralogy controls the colours that appear in this interior world. Iron-rich rocks slowly oxidize to shades of red-brown or ochre. Mafic units can darken in strong sunlight. Quartz-rich rocks may shine pale under midday illumination. Micas in some metamorphic rocks glint faintly when the sun stands at low angle. The sky above these bedrock tracts remains largely clear on most days, because moist air seldom reaches this far into Pangaea, and the resulting persistent sunlight creates shadows that move across each ridge and plateau. When the low sun angles of dawn or late afternoon cross these landscapes, the texture of bedrock is emphasized by the contrast between illuminated ridges and darker fissures. The interior remains quiet. Small reptiles continue to use crevices between slabs as hiding places. Arthropods move in shallow cracks that collect cooler air at depth. Roots of sparse vegetation reach down wherever minerals can be accessed. In rare hollows on the bedrock surface, thin films of clay settle, where water has gathered momentarily in shallow basins shaped by past erosion. The chemistry of these films is influenced by the mineral composition of the underlying rock. For example, if the rock contains feldspar weathering may liberate silica and alumina that form kaolinite or other clays. If the rock contains ferromagnesian components, iron oxides may precipitate along microfractures. These thin clay layers remain in place until wind disperses them or until a larger rain pulse redistributes them. When cloud cover occasionally forms and drops rain on these tracts, water moves quickly across polished or fractured rock surfaces without significant infiltration. The water then gathers in small depressions. Where water stands long enough, its evaporation leaves behind salts from dissolved ions. These salts crystallize as tiny crusts. Later, when drier air returns, those crusts crack and break into grains that join wind-blown sediments. Such cycles produce a thin veneer of evaporate material in minute patches. Over geologic spans, this evaporate residue can become part of the sediment transported to lower elevations. Rivers that originate near these bedrock exposures are rare, because water seldom persists in large volumes. When runoff does gather during exceptional precipitation, it moves swiftly across bare slopes, carrying fragments of rock and dust into channels that vanish again when water flow ceases. Those fragments accumulate at channel bends and form thin lenses of coarse sediment. Wind later strips finer grains off these deposits, leaving only the coarser detritus, until a later rainfall event rearranges it. The overall visual impression of this inner zone is one of stark clarity. Rock surfaces stand fully within air, and light shaped by physical weathering, rarely softened by water, and rarely woven with plant life. Every fracture provides a path for further disintegration, and every flake of spalled rock becomes a signal of continued modification at the smallest scale. This layer reveals the architecture of Pangaea's crust directly. The mineral assemblies that once recorded deep geologic processes become visible at the surface. They tell of magmas that cooled sediments that were buried and hardened, and metamorphic events that aligned minerals into complexes of foliation. Here, the crust presents itself unambiguously. No thick soil or abundant vegetation masks its structure. The air breathes over its surface with little interference. As Pangaea stands in this interval, the bedrock interior remains a significant domain that carries the signature of ancient assembly, a region where the crust of earlier continents stands open to ordinary light, unguarded by sediment cover and vulnerable to each thermal cycle of each passing day. It is an inner region where the planet's deep processes are not retold by forests or by rivers or by deserts, but by the quiet exposure of stone itself. At the scale of these exposed crustal surfaces, the next inward step becomes a matter of observing how the bare rock is altered at contact by the thin films of water-dissolved ions and biological residues that accumulate during each small wetting interval. Because although this interior region of Pangaea remains dry most of the year, the chemistry of weathering proceeds even when moisture is present for only hours or days before vanishing again. Rock surfaces do not remain inert under such cycles. The outermost microns of mineral grains interact with carbon dioxide in the air, forming weak carbonic acid films when dew or brief rainfall dissolves gas into solution. This acid film begins to leach cations from mineral lattices, weakening their bonds and freeing silica alumina or iron ions that can either stay in solution or precipitate as thin coatings when the water evaporates. The outcome is microscale destabilization of mineral boundaries and the formation of tiny clay coatings along grain edges. These coatings are not thick and do not accumulate into visible soil profiles, but they represent the earliest stage of weathering that transforms intact crystalline minerals into new secondary phases. Over time, these coatings can develop along cleavage planes in feldspar, along boundaries in mica, or along fractures in mafic minerals. The persistence of sunlight and the repeated thermal expansion and contraction create fine cracks that widen enough for dust or clay to lodge inside. When water arrives again in some later pulse, these grains can wick moisture into the crack by capillary action, prolonging the period of chemical reaction relative to surrounding rock surfaces. In this manner, chemical alteration and mechanical breakdown work jointly, one creating openings and one exploiting those openings. In small depressions and sheltered microtopography, where fragments accumulate windblown dust from the dune fields or uplands nearby, can settle. This dust includes quartz grains, clay minerals and iron oxides. When rained upon, the dust forms a gel-like film that then dries into microcrust. Under strong sunlight, the water evaporates, and the dried clay contracts, fracturing the crust into polygonal shapes. These polygons are far too small to be seen, except at the scale of millimeters or centimeters, yet these tiny contraction patterns reflect the same physical principles that govern the larger crusts of interior basins. Organic material here is sparse but not absent. Pollen grains from seed ferns or conifers can drift long distances from vegetated belts outside these interior exposures, and when they reach bare rock surfaces they can accumulate in crevices. Spores from fungi may also be transported into this interior. Arthropods that seek shade may leave fragments of exoskeleton or small fecal pellets near their shelters. These organic residues are minuscule relative to the thick peat deposits of coal swamps, but they nonetheless create microscopic carbon sources that feed microbes whenever temporary moisture returns. Such microbes may proliferate briefly and die when conditions dry again, leaving organic films that become part of the micro-weathering environment. Mineral boundaries can become discolored by iron oxides or manganese oxides after slight wetting events, when trace metals are mobilized and then precipitated again during drying. These precipitates form dark patinas referred to as rock varnish in modern arid settings. In this ancient environment, similar patinas can form over long spans of repeated exposure. The varnish layer is thin, often composed of iron and manganese oxide nanocrystals embedded in clay. They adhere strongly to the surface and change the reflectance of the rock. Their presence signals chemical engagement between stone and environment even in such dryness. Sometimes these patinas can concentrate on surfaces that face a prevailing wind because dust supply is greatest on those surfaces. In recesses where winds do not deliver much sediment, the patinas may be absent. The crust thus acquires mosaic asymmetry, some surfaces darkened by microfilms of oxides and clays, others left bare and lightly reflective. Under afternoon sunlight, these minute contrasts give the stone surface subtle tonal variation. This interior weathering zone does not produce thick soil, nor does it support active plant rooting because moisture is insufficient for root development. Instead, the rock undergoes a constant, slow transaction at the micron level. Over tens of thousands of years, these microtransformations produce cumulative change. Flakes of altered mineral detach grains loosen from their matrix, and those grains join the inventory of sediment available to wind or ephemeral runoff. Certain minerals weather faster than others. Feldspars yield clay minerals more readily than quartz. Ferromagnesian minerals yield iron oxides. These selective changes alter the grain size distribution of the detritus. Coarse fragments remain close to source. Fine clay-sized particles can ride the wind and settle far away. The bare interior of Pangaea thus becomes a generator of dust that can travel to coasts or deltas or swamp belts, and that dust then becomes part of the record in those regions, linking the interior to the margins in subtle ways. At night, the cooled rock surfaces gather small fractions of dew if air temperature drops below the dew point. That dew is thin, rarely more than a sheen. When dawn returns, the sun's rays evaporate the dew quickly. The time window for reaction is narrow, but repeated over vast spans, it is sufficient to alter the thin margin of stone at the surface. The topmost grains in fractured zones absorb sunlight, expand, contract, and loosen in cycles that repeat relentlessly. These cycles cause grains to move slightly toward fracture openings, where they are then exposed to wind at the next drying stage. When a pulse of rainfall arrives, those loose grains are washed into microdepressions, forming tiny pockets of sediment. Evaporation leaves them behind as residues. Gradually the stone becomes mantled with these micro-residues, and the residues become the feedstock for new minerals. In some cases, salt from evaporated water grows crystals in cracks and pries the rock further apart. Salt crystals may form only in specific mineral assemblages where cations can concentrate. But over time, these salt episodes compound the mechanical fracturing initiated by temperature change. The result of all these processes is that the crust beneath remains the same rock in composition and structure, but the rock surface carries the cumulative imprint of micro-alteration, revealing a thin interface where energy, moisture, and chemistry meet. This weathered interface is not thick enough to host soil horizons, but it is developed enough to create the first step in the transformation of rock into sediment. Because this section remains interior, it does not introduce soil or plant systems, but remains concentrated on the micrometer to millimeter scale, where bedrock interacts with environment. This layer emphasizes that the inner crust of Pangaea is not static stone, but a reactive medium shaped by air, water, light, and time on the smallest scales. At the deepest inward level, the surface of Pangaea becomes a field of individual mineral grains and microtextures, where the record of interaction between rock and air rock and transient water and rock and drifting detritus is expressed not as visible landforms, but as a quilt of discrete particles that accumulate, shift, combine, and reorganize into the smallest units of sediment. At this scale, every impact of a grain against another grain has meaning. A single quartz fragment loosened from a crystalline host becomes a traveller across fractures moving millimetre by millimetre, under the influence of wind shear or ephemeral sheet flow generated by a brief rainfall. Clay platelets formed from chemical weathering of feldspar accumulate as thin parallel stacks in minute hollows. Iron oxide nanocrystals precipitated along microfractures build into microscopic nodules. These units are far below the scale of a sand dune or a river delta, and exist entirely in the front line between intact bedrock and detached debris. Each particle is a record of energy, chemistry, and time. Quartz retains its shape and hardness as it separates from a host rock. Clay retains its platy habit after nucleating along cleavage planes. Micas curl when layers detach. Ferromagnesian minerals lose their luster when iron becomes oxidized. In the stillness of interior Pangaea, these microtextures persist for long periods because nothing brushes them away rapidly. Wind is intermittent and water is episodic. Once detached grains gather into microdrifts along small irregularities of the bedrock. One ridge of only a few millimeters that is aligned against a prevailing breeze can trap grains from 100 meters upwind. The trapped grains then trap other grains. With time, the pile becomes a pocket of sediment that deepens by microns each year. A single patch of such sediment might carry a record of thousands of daily thermal expansions in rock, dozens of dew events, and a handful of small rain pulses that arrived over centuries. At this smaller scale, the imprint of biological activity persists only in a statistical sense. A pollen grain might lodge between clay platelets. A spore might become part of a microcrust. A microscopic fragment of fungal hypha might be preserved when dried mud contracts. Yet the narrative here is dominated by inorganic texture and the interplay of mineral and atmosphere. The atmosphere, though dry most of the year, still contains gases that control the chemistry of these grains. Carbon dioxide dissolves into dew to form carbonic acid that leaches cations. Oxygen oxidizes ferrous iron to ferric iron. Moisture held between grain boundaries imposes capillary forces that create bridges of water between mineral surfaces. When water evaporates, salts precipitate and cement grains temporarily. These bonds break when thermal expansion or new influx of moisture disrupt them. Repetition of such transient bonds forms the base mechanism for the aggregation of microsediments. Where the bedrock is dark with mafic composition, dark grains of magnetite or ilmenite can mix with pale quartz. Where the bedrock is light granite or metamorphosed sandstone, quartz grains dominate. When the microdrift lies on a surface that becomes momentarily saturated, grains settle into water and then dry into crusts that split along polygons. These micropolygons are analogues of larger mud cracks far outside this interior zone. Over vast time, these microscopic sediments can move outward. A rare storm might carry them into a shallow ephemeral channel where they join larger sediment loads that feed into lower flanks of uplands. In those flanks, the micrograins join with coarser fractions produced by mechanical breakdown higher in the highlands. If repeated storm pulses are sufficient, then this micro-derived sediment is carried still farther outward towards sand seas or even eventually into marginal basins if conditions align. In that way, the smallest grains from the heart of the supercontinent become part of sediment budgets in distant realms. But the narrative here remains fixed at this inner location, and the outward journey of those grains is only implied by the physical possibility rather than followed as a story. At this scale, the crust tells a different language than at the macroscale. Here, mineral assemblages tell of deep time. Zircon grains carry isotopic memories of ancient melts. Muscovite flakes hold the signature of metamorphic dehydration. Quartz and feldspar preserved in crystalline form show growth zoning. Iron oxides show cumulative precipitation cycles. All of this is present in particles that are smaller than grains of table salt in later human reference frames. Within these microtextures lies the final step of the inward path. The earlier outward levels showed the supercontinent as a planetary surface, then as ocean, then as coastal shelf, then as swamp belt, then as air above forests, then as near-ground reptile habitats, then as deltas, then as monsoon gradients, then as interior dryness, then as dune fields, then as uplands, then as exposed bedrock. Now the bedrock becomes particulate. The continuum of landscape has reached the terminal detail where the planet's crust interacts directly with atmosphere 1 grain at a time. The loose material here awaits burial or removal. Given enough time, the grains can become sedimentary layers. Compaction, cementation, and diagenesis can bind them, or they may simply remain transient dust in these dry interiors. In this domain, nothing is stable for long. Each grain can be moved by wind or water pulse. Yet this instability of individual units produces the foundation for stable geologic archives that later appear as sandstone, siltstone, or shale. When sediments accumulate, they bury grains like these. They press them together. They cement them. They immortalize the small into the permanent. And those permanent records then transmit the story of this ancient land. At this scale, the smallest pieces of Pangaea tell that the supercontinent is not static stone, but a dynamic surface where grains and ions circulate. Even without active erosion by rivers, these grains migrate by wind or dew-driven change. They record that the interior of Pangaea is an engine of sediment generation. They set the stage for every basin, every delta, every shelf outward. The entire outward to inward journey converges here in the grain. This inner region, this microtexture, this particulate boundary is therefore the final spatial step in describing what Pangaea looked like when focusing from cosmos to coastline to forest to desert to crust, and finally into the smallest building blocks of the land itself,